Dr. David Cohen, and David is the chief academic. He's the head of biblical studies at Voss Seminary. It's a real privilege to have David join with us this morning. You're very welcome, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say as you reflect on the passage of Spurgeon that you're going to read this morning. So I'm going to take myself off the screen, David, and it's over to you.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here and to share with you. And so I'm reading a sermon by Spurgeon entitled Comforted and Comforting, and it's based around 2 Corinthians chapter 1. That's a passage that many of us will be familiar with. Of course, here in 2 Corinthians, Paul the Apostle is quite vulnerable in talking about his struggles and his weaknesses. And in this sermon, Spurgeon reflects on how Paul deals with that as an apostle, and he draws from that some principles and some ideas, some thoughts about how his congregation might also deal with their trials and tribulations in life. So this is entitled Comforted and Comforting, Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit Sermons, volume 45, 1899. The apostle was a much tried man, and he lived in an age when all believers were peculiarly tried. The persecutions of that time were excessively severe, and every man who called himself a Christian had to carry his life in his hand. In this tribulation, the apostle had the largest share, because he was the most prominent and indefatigable teacher that the Church of Christ then possessed. We have here a little insight into his inner life. He needed comfort, and he received it. And he had it in such abundance that he became a comforter of others. Although without Christ, he would have been of all men most miserable. I think I may say that with Christ and the blessed hope of the resurrection, he was among all men one of the most happy. I am to speak of the comforting fact which Paul here mentions. The God of all comfort comforteth us in all our tribulation. This was Paul's declaration, and I also may speak in the name of many here present, and say that it is not only true of Paul and the Christians of his day, but it is also true of us. The God of all comfort has comforted us in our tribulation. Look back now on the pages of your diary that bear the record of your sorrow. Do they not also bear the record of the Lord's help in that sorrow and his deliverance from the sorrow? If I cannot speak for all of you, I will speak for myself. I must do so, or else surely the very timber on which I stand might cry out against me. The Lord has been very gracious to me in many an hour of affliction. Blessed be his name. He has never failed to bring the solace when he has made the smart. And if there has been the stroke with the rod, there has very soon been the caress of his love to follow, the blow of his hand. It has been so with many of us. But Paul speaks in the present tense, who comforteth us in all our tribulation. And we also can declare that God is now comforting us who believe in Jesus. Did you, beloved, come into this building somewhat heavy in spirit? You are not half so heavy now as you were. And if you will take the good advice I am trying to give, you will go away quite relieved. Rutherford used to say that the cross of Christ was no more a burden to the man who knew how to carry it than wings are to a bird or sails are to a ship. An affliction is a help to us, not a hindrance, when grace comes with it to sanctify it. Remember, David said long ago, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain them. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved." But if you cast your burden upon the Lord, do not go looking after it when I have pronounced the benediction. Leave it altogether. The fault with many of us is that when we have cast our burden upon the Lord, we beg him to let us have it back again. And if he grants our foolish request, it comes back twice as heavy as it was before. Oh, that we were wise enough to leave our troubles with our Father, who is in heaven, as little children leave things with their Father. Then we shall find that he comforts us in our tribulation. Aye, but our text is true of the future as well as the present. Here, if we cannot speak by experience, we can speak by faith. A little child who loves his father has no doubt about his father's comforting him next year, as well as this. And you must have no doubt about what God will do for you, dear friends, especially you aged ones. He has comforted, he is comforting, and he will comfort. And Paul puts it in such a way as to make us feel that he will never leave off comforting us, even for a single moment, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, not in some of it, but in all of it. Our tribulations sometimes change, and a new cross is generally a very heavy one. The old crosses get at last to fit the back, and we can carry them better than we could at the first. But the new cross galls the shoulders that have not yet grown used to it. But the Lord your God will help you in your new tribulations as well as in your old ones. And if they come thick and threefold, tribulation upon tribulation, trouble upon trouble, still as your days, so shall your strength be. And he who has comforted and is comforting will continue to comfort you even to the last. Now I must close with a few remarks upon the comforting design of which our text speaks. Why does God lay trouble upon his people and comfort them in it? It is that he may make them comforters of others, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble. A person who has never had any trouble is very awkward when they try to comfort troubled hearts. Hence, the minister of Christ, if they are to be of much use in God's service, must have great trouble. Prayer, meditation, and affliction, says Melanchthon, are the three things that make the minister of God. There must be prayer, there must be meditation, and there must be affliction. You cannot pronounce the promise aright in the ear of the afflicted unless you yourself have known its preciousness in your own hour of trial. It is God's will that the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, should work by men full often, according to that ancient word of his, comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem. These comforting servants are to be made. They are not born so, and they have to be made by passing through the furnace themselves. They cannot comfort others unless they have had trouble and have been comforted in it. More than this, the intent of God is to make us able comforters, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble. Some have the will to comfort the troubled, but they have not the power to do it. Miserable comforters are ye all, said Job to his friends. And the same has been said to many of those who have really tried to comfort the sorrowing, but who in the process have put their fingers in the open wounds and so made them worse instead of better. Brothers and sisters, the able comforter must be one who knows both the trial and the promise that is suited to meet it. Beside that, we are to be ready comforters, for we are to comfort them which are in any trouble, by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. Experiential knowledge helps a man to speak with power to the afflicted soul. He who has taken certain medicine and proven the benefit of it is the man to recommend it to another. Hence, the Lord often passes his ministers through trials which they would never have to endure if it were not for their people. Even as upon the chief shepherd of all the wanderings of the flock had to be laid so, in a very minor sense, the wanderings of the flock must be borne by the under shepherd, or else he cannot be a comforter to them. Dear friends, the next time you get into trouble, I would recommend you take notes of it and to ask yourself when it is over, how did God comfort me? Lay that cordial up in store, because one of these days you will want that comfort again. Or, if not, you will meet somebody who is in just the same fix as you were in. And you will be able to say, I know what will help you, for I have it down in black and white at home. How God helped me in a trouble exactly like yours. As I was reading a book this afternoon, this sentence struck me. Whenever thou comest into the mouth of the furnace, say to thyself, God has some great work for me to do, and he is preparing me for it. I thought to myself, I have not often said that in the time of trial. My thoughts have been too much taken up with the furnace to think of the good which was to result from the fire. But I'm sure that what that writer said is true. God means to do something more by us, which, speaking after the manner of men, he cannot yet do by us. We are not qualified for it, but he is going to put us through a hotter furnace still. The heat is to be more intense than any we have yet borne. And when we come out, we shall be more fit for the Master's use. Welcome your trials then, beloved. Open wide your doors and say to tribulations, come in, come in. This is the place where you are to lodge. For my Master said, in the world ye shall have tribulation. Welcome even that trouble that has a mask on its face. It is no adversary coming to kill you. When the mask is taken off, you will see that underneath it there is a bright, smiling face. Some of us can say to affliction, come in and welcome, for the costliest jewels we ever possessed were brought by you. You have done us more good than all our joys put together. Therefore, again I say, welcome your troubles. Do not be sorry if they travel with you for a while, for they are good guests. Many a time, by entertaining trouble, we have entertained angels unawares. God bless you, brethren and sisters, by making you a comfort to others, and probably it will be through the very trials which greatly vex you. Now to close, there may be some poor soul here broken down under the sense of sin, some seeker who cannot find the Saviour. He may speak to some of you who were brought to Christ without any very strong emotion. He will begin telling you about his despair, and you will look at him and say, dear me, where has this man got to? Then do not try to help him, for you cannot. You have not had the experience through which he is passing. Find out the brother who had a hard time of it in getting to the wicket gate. That poor fellow who tumbled into the slough of despond with his big burden on his back and nearly got choked in the mire. Say to him, brother Christian, here is another soul floundering about, just as you were once. Hand him over to such a person, because he will be the most likely to help him. Any of you who had great difficulty in laying hold of Christ at the first ought to be on watch to find others who are as you were. Stretch out the helping hand to them and say, we would not have you suffer as we did if we can help it. We wish to show you the way of Jesus Christ and to get you to see it more quickly than we did. We even hope that you will this very night find joy and peace in believing. Do look after the broken-hearted ones, dear friends. Watch for Mr. Feeble-Mind. Find out poor Mr. Fearing. Do not let him lie outside long. Help him over the stile, and as you have yourself found mercy, administer it in the name of God to all who are longing to find it. May God bless you all for Christ's sake. Amen. This is a wonderful message from Spurgeon, and he encourages us to think about a number of issues. And I guess as I reflected on what I've seen in this sermon and what I've heard from Spurgeon's heart, it does remind me very much of the situation, the circumstances that we find ourselves in our world today, in the 21st century. As you'll all know, the one story that we hear in our world today, among many, is the story of COVID-19 and how the pandemic is affecting nations right across the world in many different ways. And it's interesting because from my own personal reflection, it's the first time in my lifetime that I've experienced something that has literally touched the whole world. And so all of my international friends and many of you listening, watching today will have had some experience of COVID-19. Perhaps it's even touched your family or friends that you know. And this is just the reality of our situation. And so we find ourselves in our world today all in this situation of great distress to varying degrees and seeking comfort. And so this message from Spurgeon, I think, is very timely. It's quite remarkable that something preached so long ago could be so relevant, so pertinent to our situation today. As I reflected on what Spurgeon says, I think he highlights some very simple things in some respects, but quite profound things. And I want to just share a few reflections and thoughts, and I'm sure as I do this, other things will come to your mind, and I would encourage you to go away and continue to reflect on these quite profound words. I think the most important thing that Spurgeon reminds us of is that when Paul is seeking to be comforted, he turns to his God. And as I mentioned a moment ago, that may sound very simple and very basic, and yet in our world of busyness and in our world, for some of us, where we feel like we have a lot of capacity and a lot of capabilities, it's a reminder that actually in our distress, it's important for us as people of faith to throw ourselves on the God of all comfort. And Paul's reminder, and Spurgeon reinforces this, is that God is in fact a God of comforting. God is not a God who will leave us in our distress, but God is rather one who will come alongside us. And as he reflects in his sermon, he reminds us of the ministry of Christ. As we read through the Gospels, we see time after time, occasion after occasion, where Christ draws alongside those who need comforting. And he comforts them in that situation. Spurgeon also reminds us that this comfort that comes from God is significant because, in part, it helps us to grow. The distress that we experience, the trials that we experience, the tribulations that we experience, the crosses that we need to bear are beneficial for us because they are the moments in which we grow. And again, this is something that we may not see as desirable, and yet it is something that is deeply necessary. As we go through life, and Spurgeon reminds us of this, when we are in times of happiness and joy, while they're wonderful to experience, we don't tend to learn a lot at those moments. However, in times of tribulation and trouble, there's an opportunity for us to learn much. And I think one of the other things that Spurgeon alludes to and actually mentions specifically on a couple of occasions as well is the idea of reflecting and even recording our thoughts and our reactions. I love his reference to the idea of a diary, or today we might call it a journal. And many of you may, in fact, engage in that practice of journaling. I certainly do for myself. And part of that is to write down the experiences that I have and reflect on them and try to make sense out of what's happening. And Spurgeon's encouragement is that as we look back over the span of our life, whether it's a long time in the past or in recent days, we might actually look at our diary. We might actually look at our journal, whether it's a physical one or it's something that's in our heart and our mind. And it'll remind us of the experiences that we have had, particularly the difficult experiences. And it may give us some insights into what we've learnt, how we've grown, how we've matured, and what God might want to teach us through those experiences of life. Spurgeon also reminds us that we experience trials and tribulations so that we might be equipped to care for those around us. And I find this an incredibly important concept, particularly within the context of our faith communities, our churches and our home groups and other contexts where we meet with fellow Christians, and also more broadly than that, when we come into contact with people in our workplaces or where we study or in our families who may not necessarily be people of faith, but still suffer distress. And Spurgeon's encouragement here is that part of our experience of experiencing those things ourselves is that we may then be able to stand with those who experience similar things to us in solidarity, not necessarily saying we know exactly what you've experienced, but solidarity in the sense of we have suffered, we have gone through trials, we have gone through tribulations, and we have been comforted with God. And so we take that comfort of God and we share that with those who are around us. I think that's a really important encouragement, and it's such a gift that we have in our faith communities, that we can stand with those who are struggling, sometimes struggling in enormous ways, and we can stand with them and support them. I was also reminded, and of course Spurgeon alludes to this in his sermon as well, David in the Psalms. And as we read through the Psalms, again, we see many, many examples of where the psalmist cries out to God in their despair, in their distress. And as the psalmist cries out to God, doesn't just express the pain of trial and tribulation, but actually asks God to address that, asks God to do something about their situation. And so as I reflected on that aspect of Spurgeon's message here, it reminds me that this God of comfort is a God who is actually actively willing to be involved in our lives and to bring comfort to us in our distress. But a part of that is that we need to be willing to cry out. That doesn't mean that God won't comfort us if we don't cry out, but it seems to be the pattern, at least of the psalmists, that they cry out and then they see and experience God responding to the tribulation, to the trial, to the distress that they are experiencing. I think it's also important that we're aware of people's lives around us, that we don't always perceive exactly the stress or the distress, if you like, that they are under. And I've been reminded of this in past years when I was in pastoral ministry, that often I had people in my congregations who on the surface looked like life was going quite well, quite smoothly. And I had to be reminded sometimes, and sometimes these people themselves reminded me, or others did, that in fact, deep within their lives, within their families, there was a level of tribulation, a level of trouble that was causing them great distress. And so Spurgeon's reminder to us is not just that we've been comforted in order to comfort others, but that as we look at other people, we need to be reminded that there is deep distress present all around us. And for me, I see that within our faith communities, but I'm also reminded as I mix with people outside of faith communities, there are many people around us who do not have faith. And I think this is one of the perhaps differences between Spurgeon's context and ours, is that For Spurgeon, he was preaching to a society that was largely churched. That didn't necessarily mean that they were all people of Christian faith or committed Christian faith, but they were largely people who had an understanding of Christian faith. They had an understanding of the nature and character of God. Of course, today, for many of us, particularly in the Western world, we exist in a context that is secular. And so we're rubbing shoulders with people on a daily basis who are certainly distressed on the one hand, but on the other hand have no sense of God, let alone a God who is a comforting God, a God who might come alongside them. And in my experience, it's been exciting, actually, quite encouraging to be able to share, as Spurgeon encourages us, to be able to share with people around me that it is God who has comforted me. It is God who has come alongside me in my trial and tribulation. And that has helped me to be able to comfort the people around me, whether they're people of faith or not people of faith. And that's a wonderful privilege that we have. I think the last thing I'd like to address is that also Spurgeon mentions this idea that trials and tribulations are brought upon us by God for our learning, for our growth and for our maturation. And I think he makes a very valid point there, although I think there's a caution, and of course that is that there are times when we can imagine that trial and tribulation has come upon us because of what God has done. The reminder is that this is not necessarily always the case. And so sometimes what we find is that we suffer trial and tribulation simply because we suffer trial and tribulation. There's no particular rhyme and reason to it. And so I think as a bit of a caution or a bit of a reminder, it's good for us to remember that certainly, as Spurgeon encourages us, our trial and tribulation teach us to learn and to grow, but also we need to remember that not all trial and tribulation comes directly from God. So I think there are some wonderful encouragements there from Spurgeon's sermon, and I would encourage you to reflect on the words of the sermon, reflect on some of the thoughts that I have shared. I guess the last thing that I want to say to you, and I find I've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth reinforcing it, the idea of recording our thoughts. And for me, at a personal level, that's something that I engage in on quite a regular basis. I do a journaling process where I reflect not just on the trials and tribulations, I also reflect on the joys and the things that I can be thankful for, because gratitude, of course, is a very important principle and a very important thing to remember. But I think, when we bring all of those together in a recorded sense, it gives us an opportunity to do some of the things that Spurgeon was talking about. And that is that recognising that God is a God who comforted in the past, who comforts in the present, and who comforts in the future. If we're recording these kinds of things and we can look back on them, it gives us an opportunity to be able to reflect on those thoughts and find the God of comfort in our circumstance where we currently are. So I hope those thoughts are helpful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of Spurgeon's sermons that follow. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. It's interesting just to see how applicable Spurgeon's ministry is today. But I have to confess, I smiled at that part where he said that some believers hand their burden over and then immediately want it back again. I can almost imagine him laughing as he said that.
It's quite humorous.
Yeah, indeed, very much so. David, thank you so much for your ministry to us this morning and your participation. Our partnership with Voss Seminary is very important to Spurgeon's College, and please give our greetings to all your staff and students. I will. Thank you very much for me sharing. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.